Hello everyone, Eric Hall with the Blaze of Glory. Today I'm going to do my little book review of Once Upon a While. Now I do not believe there is anything in this book that actually helps us find a treasure chest. I don't really think there are any hints, clues, or actionable intelligence herein. But it falls under the heading of studying the man. Douglas Preston wrote the foreword to this book. And in 2017, he put out I think it was an email or a Facebook posting about the foreword, which made absolutely no sense. He tells us to look at the foreword. He says there is an extremely important clue to the possible location of the treasure. Now, did you understand what he just said? Extremely important clue to a possible location, not the location. So it's an extremely important clue that refers us to a location that does us absolutely no good. That means it's a waste of space. Douglas Preston says that he knew he was a friend of Forrest Fenn when Forrest invited him into his house, into his vault, back in the 1990s. Now this was supposedly Preston's first visit there. And this was in the 90s. And he's talking about all of Forrest's artifacts and collectibles. And he goes through the story we've all heard about Forrest having cancer and possibly planning on committing suicide, but having this plan about a treasure chest that would get people into the outdoors. Now he says he saw this bronze casket on this first visit in the 90s. Now, Forrest Fenn always refers to that as a treasure chest. I don't think it was until the discovery of the replica chest at the Detroit Institute of the Arts that we heard that term casket, but it is the word that Preston uses. He tells about the gold nuggets, the packet of $100 or $500 and $1,000 bills. He describes that original plan that Forrest had to put an IOU into the treasure chest. Preston tells us about the original poem which he had seen at the time, and then tells us that it was different from the final version that we later got published in the book. It is important to note that Doug Preston said that the original poem was easier to read, or presumably easier to follow, than the final poem that we've been presented with. He tells us that he tried to get a movie made based on the plot and plan that Forrest had set into place, but that was not successful, so Preston tells us he wrote the novel, The Codex, which copies the same story that Forrest had envisioned about hiding a treasure chest after being diagnosed with cancer. Then Preston gives us that one important piece of information that he went back to Forrest's vault back in August of 2010 and noticed the chest was gone, and that's when Forrest allegedly said, "I did it, I finally hid the chest." The rest of the foreword is just a summary of Forrest Fenn's life, his military time, his story of being shot down twice, the successful art gallery, and all of the other unique things that Forrest Fenn has done to make him stand out from the rest of us. The first chapter is entitled Supplemental Punishment. Now, once again, Forrest tells stories about getting a whipping, either for locking his sister out of the bathroom or putting itching powder in his brother's shorts. His supplemental punishment was to have to do the supper dishes. And I noticed he even specifically mentions the smelly gravy pan. Now, we were told before that he didn't like the sight or smell of brown gravy. It had to do with his experiences at the Totem Cafe in West Yellowstone. I'm thinking this might have something to do with his childhood supplemental punishment, cleaning the supper gravy pan, which he described as smelly. And then he goes on to tell us how he would get revenge on his family by doing a terrible karaoke version of opera singing as loud as he could to drive the family out of the house. He said he was singing to the kitchen appliances, and after he got finished with his revenge, his father never punished him again by washing the dishes. The next chapter is the long jump. This is the story of jumping off the Leon River Bridge on the edge of Temple, Texas. Now, you may recall that I recently visited that bridge and took some updated pictures. Here in the book, it shows 3 of these arches or trusses of the bridge. That bridge has been remodeled. There's only 1 of those there now. But Forrest tells the story about how his friends, or perhaps the members of his gang from Temple, they went out together to this bridge and talked about, they were going to jump off the bridge, but Forrest couldn't do it. He said his tail fell out like a lizard. He got scared, and he was worried about what all the girls were going to think. I think it was the junior year of high school, so that must have been his junior year. He was worried about what they were going to think. And then he goes back out there at 3 in the morning in the middle of the night when it was cold and jumps in the river, apparently to impress the girls and his gang, even though none of them were there to watch him do it. And he decided to keep it a secret that he had done this at 3 in the morning. Which leaves us asking the question, did he really do it? There was no witnesses. One of the things I notice here in this story is, on page 8, one of these ridiculous postmarks that he likes to use. In the other books, if there was a date for the postmark, then it was that year. If it was indeterminate as to the year, there was no date. Well, here this is showing 1936. His junior year of high school would have been somewhere around 47-ish. And he tells about going out there in his 35 Plymouth. And we know from the prior stories, he bought that right around the end of World War II, maybe 45-ish. And then he graduated high school in 48. So there's some discrepancy on that number there, the date. There are 2 things in this story that strike me as having a parallel to our treasure hunt. And it's probably just me reaching here. But I have gone alone in there, and I can keep my secret where? This thing about jumping into the Leon River in the middle of the night with no one around to watch him, that's a place he went alone. And then he tells us he wants to keep it a secret. He doesn't want anybody else to know. I can keep my secret where? I don't know. I just think that's interesting. Is there a bridge out at the treasure site that somebody could jump off of? The next chapter is entitled Sweet Fragrances. Here, Forrest reminisces about the time he spent in his mother's kitchen when she was cooking and how he enjoyed sniffing of the spices from the kitchen cabinet. He tells how his mother could detect if the smell was good or bad based upon the pucker of his nose. And then years later, he goes through his wife's kitchen doing the same thing with the spices and scratching up the kitchen table. The rest of this chapter I do not get. Why we're getting a lecture on spices. I see no purpose in this chapter. One that he does mention on page 17 is turmeric, which contains curcumin, which is, even the doctors say that that is a promising spice or herb to be taken because it does wonders for things like heart disease and other health problems. Later down the page, he makes a comment that espresso is a drink for girls. I guess he's not a big fan of places like Starbucks. Well, neither am I. The hilarious thing is his dislike for cloves. He described it as terrible and needing to suck on an ice cube afterwards. And it's mentioned on page 12, page 14, and page 18. And the last time he even circles it in red. It's probably not significant for us, but he's emphasizing his disgust for cloves. He ends the chapter by asking, I wonder if my wife has bought another jar of cloves. The next chapter, An Education from Stanley. Here is where Forrest tells us that he lost interest in staying in the Air Force. After all, he had his 20 years in, right? He had his retirement check coming. But he said when he spent time on the ground in the Laotian jungle that it gave him time to think. This reminds me of him thinking in the cemetery. But he had time to think that there was something better to life than this. He had flown 328 missions, lost a roommate, was shot down twice, and therefore he decided to turn down a promotion, and it was time to leave the Air Force. And then we begin the story of moving to Santa Fe and opening an art gallery. He said he had diametrically opposed goals. He needed to feed his family, but he didn't want to wear a suit and tie. And he also wanted a business where his average customer would pay $2,500. What a lofty goal. I guess he wasn't planning on working at McDonald's. So he decided he was going to have to be in business for himself. He started by continuing his bronze foundry business, but then one day he acquired a Persian rug with threads of gold in it that was once held by the Shah of Iran. He felt certain that he was headed for life in the fast lane, and he said that his lack of education and business experience was paying dividends. He asked himself that question of why anybody would pay $65,000 for an original piece of artwork when you could pay for a print or a copy for $150. Stanley gave Forrest Fenn the comparison of two women with identical dresses, one coming from J.C. Penney's and one coming from Neiman Marcus. He asked, how do you know the difference between the two? The woman who paid too much for it is walking with much more ego and pride. And so it's ego that would drive somebody to pay $65,000 for a piece of original artwork. And we're told that Stanley was involved in selling expensive and unnecessary gifts through the Neiman Marcus, such as a submarine or his and her airplanes and a live tiger. The next chapter, The Loom of the Desert. Here, Forrest is telling us a story about a book that I think was all of 12 pages long, written in 1907. Ida, the author, is telling a story about a lady named Martha who had lost 3 sons and her husband, and she writes this letter that she's leaving her husband because he never did anything for her or never took her anywhere, and so she's taking leave for a year to take herself with some other man on a vacation. Forrest says that Ida writes in Technicolor. He thinks that other books should be written much this same way. The next chapter, Me and Little Beaver. Forrest reminisces about the 1938 comic strip entitled Red Ryder. Here, Little Beaver and his Indian sidekick, they go off to chase the bad guys. The good guys in the white hat, the bad guys in the black hat. Forrest tells us that his father bought him a Red Ryder BB gun, and he used it to shoot the meadowlark birds that he could provide for the Fenn family at supper time. At one point, Red Ryder was apparently the biggest syndicated comic strip in the United States. And then later, Fred Harmon went into painting, and 40 years later, Forrest Fenn met Fred Harmon when Forrest apparently was selling one of Harmon's pieces of art. And Harmon told Forrest that he was getting something like a 5-cent royalty on every Red Ryder BB gun that had been sold. And Forrest is reminiscing about his BB gun, which he has willed to Shiloh. He mentions the Fred Harmon Museum in Pagosa Springs. Now, Fred Harmon had spent time on both coasts of this country. I wonder if Pagosa Springs, because it's in our search area, I know Bill Gorman would agree that this is an area of interest. And even I have said I'd like to drive through there, but I don't know how the clues fit near Pagosa Springs. Next chapter, Shelling Corn. This is where Forrest introduces us to a painting by his friend Joseph Sharp. And Forrest tells the entire pedigree of this painting from when it was first sold for, I think, a barter, and eventually it was sold repeatedly, and eventually getting up to $750,000. Does this remind you of Forrest's admonition to Eric Sloane to start out selling the painting for $17 a square inch, and then years later it'll be thousands of dollars per square inch? Now, I don't see anything all that special about the painting on the next page. I notice there's a word here where it describes sitting on a banco, or a bench, and he had used that same word in one of the previous writings to describe his father, Marvin, sitting on a banco. Do you know in modern art there are people out there that have thrown buckets of paint on a wall that mean and look like absolutely nothing and then sell it for 20 or 40 million dollars? I don't know what that's got to do with this. I just don't understand people paying a fortune for a piece of artwork. Do like Forrest says and spend $150 on the print copy. Forrest goes on about his meeting with Elkfoot Jerry Mariball when Forrest was working on his biography for Joseph Sharp. He said that Jerry was totally blind, and yet when Forrest came in the room, he says, "It's nice to see you, Mr. Fenn." Forrest described this experience with Jerry as being mind-expanding. He said he didn't want to interrupt the guy with his own weak thoughts. And as he left, the granddaughter said, "The leaves will soon fall from the apricot tree." And the next day, Jerry died. He mentioned some of the other Indian names from people that he had met there in Taos, and he says that their names are somehow romanticized in the translation. The next chapter, experiences with Joe. Joe apparently was an older black man who lived and worked in Temple when Forrest was a kid. This was one of those elders that he respected. He would spend time, I think, doing some work with him, took some mincemeat pies to him. Forrest said that Joe was selling magazines on the corner, but Forrest was too poor to afford even one, so he worked out an arrangement with Joe where he would read it and then take it back to Joe in the morning before school, because Joe had to return all these magazines to get credit for the ones that hadn't been sold. He even tells of Joe doing work greasing wagon wheels in his younger days, and how he would get money by acting as a middleman selling turkeys. And Joe even had a story of being up in Hillsboro, Texas, which is about an hour north of Temple. And he was there one day when Bonnie and Clyde committed a robbery, and a piece of paper with a poem on it that apparently Bonnie had written, they had lost, and Joe picked it up and kept it, had it in his family Bible, and Forrest was allowed to read it, but he said it wasn't anything significant. But at the start of this chapter, Forrest talks about reading funny books, as they were called, before Forrest became a teenager. He said they weren't funny, but that's what they were called. And then they were changed to comic books, and Forrest lamented that change. He liked them being called funny books, even though they weren't funny. When you get over to page 42, the very last line in this chapter, he talks about how now that he is old, nobody wants to listen to what he has to say, even though he was always willing to listen to these old wise sages, and he has all of his life. But he says that now, because people don't want to listen to him, he spends time alone, and at least I like the company. You know, I think there was a country song along those lines. You know, "Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble." The line says, "But who cares? I never get lonesome. I treasure my own company." The next chapter, glory is never enough. Here, Forrest Fenn reminisces about his time quarterbacking for the Kittens football team, and apparently he's kept this football as some sort of a treasure. The next chapter, explosion on 3rd Street. Now here we are at that fireworks stand that Skippy and his friend Leroy had at the corner of 3rd and French. This is where the two juvenile girls decided to light a firecracker, throw it into the fireworks stand, and blow the place up. The aerial bombettes were ignited, and Forrest described the explosion as something that could be heard 2 miles away at the cemetery. This is that same cemetery where he would go to in the middle of the night to think. The hair on both Skippy and Leroy caught fire, and they dove out into the street, and cars were screeching and trying to avoid bodies in the road. And it was while Skippy was in the hospital that this train of visitors showed up, including Peggy Jean Proctor. This was the first time Forrest met her, and they would marry 8 years later. Forrest concludes this chapter by suggesting that he was merely tagging along in Skippy's life, as if somehow Skippy was the only one who would get into trouble. The chapter, Divorce Logic. Here, Forrest meets a professional potter. Her divorce had gone to pot, so he tried humor, suggesting that she make a pot in the nature of her divorce, and we'd have a funeral for it. He says that this lady made the pot was the ugliest thing he'd ever seen, and it had the word Ferd on it, F-E-R-D. And later, as they were having this ceremonial funeral, she screamed and yelled and sang, and somewhere in there she yelled, "Fred!" And Forrest gets the idea that maybe he should have been a therapist instead of an art dealer. The next chapter, Once in a While I Do Something Right. When I saw the name of this chapter, I thought about the earlier story of Fenn entertaining children at his art gallery, where he would let them touch George Washington's nose, and this lady came up to him years later and said, "Do you remember me? I touched George Washington." And he said, "Sometimes I get something right." Well, in this chapter, he's talking about Wilson Hurley. This was another military veteran. He had personal letters from MacArthur and Eisenhower. He was a painter, and according to Forrest, he was a good one. But he was in a car crash and was unable to paint for a year, and Fenn was called to testify as an expert witness as to the value of the painting, or the lost income from painting, that Wilson Hurley would have lost during that time. And Forrest goes on a rant about what he thought about the judge and the defense lawyer. I've been there. I can relate to that. And Forrest offered to withdraw his oath because the defense lawyer didn't want Forrest to give lengthy answers. And eventually the judge agreed to let Forrest answer as he pleased. And apparently the jury snickered and was entertained by this episode. Forrest tells of liking the Matlock programs, and was it Gary or Jerry Spence, great trial lawyers. He never lost a criminal case. And apparently this guy said something that stuck with Forrest, was that it's much better to have the best lawyer in the courtroom rather than to be innocent. Well, I don't know about that unless you're going to be wrongfully found guilty. Next chapter, Annabella's hat. Forrest meets this sheep herder. Had arrowheads, and the guy was lighting a rolled cigarette with like a striker that he used against a piece of flint. He did it one-handed, and Forrest was amazed. But this guy had a hat that appeared to be made out of buffalo skin. It was a very old hat, and it had a bullet hole in it. The sheep herder got caught. Annabella's husband showed up, and that's how the bullet hole ended up in there. Well, Forrest paid $300 for this hat, and he uses it as a bragging right because of the story that goes with it. Next chapter, I never go shopping, but have you ever known old people, when they get to a certain point in life, they just belt out whatever comes to their mind? They have no filter, no restraint. Well, this is one of those stories. Forrest is down at the supermarket. This woman comes in who's in a big hurry. She's got tattoos and piercings and curlers all up in her hair, and she's stocking up on beer. And Forrest realized he was no match for her speed or her pace running through the store. He's 87, and he finally asked the woman how many stations she could get with that thing, looking at her hair. Of course, the lady got very upset. Forrest is making sure nobody can see his hands because she's acting as though she's being attacked. Forrest concludes by giving his opposition to tattoos and piercings, suggesting that if younger people want to express themselves, they should try writing instead. The next chapter, The Unfortunate Hiccup. This is about watching the 1949 Masters Golf Tournament. I don't know why this story's in here either. I did find it interesting that there's a person drinking alcohol from a flask that looks like a pair of binoculars. Next chapter, In a Tuck. Here Forrest is talking about his time in radar school, or in his radar position afterwards, where they're jumping off a tower, which is like a diving board, into the water, and he compares it to jumping off that Leon River Bridge down in Temple. He says in neither case would anybody jump in head first. Well, somehow he managed to land on his back, and he said it was a blistering pain. His friend Sam, that was with him during this story, left the Air Force after 4 years, whereas Forrest stayed in. And apparently Sam's kid died in a drowning accident, and then sometime thereafter, Sammy died of a heart attack. And Forrest laments that some things like that are hard to explain. He goes on to talking about visiting Peggy's family in Eunice, Louisiana, and how the Korean War had just started, and he had to be back in time to his radar school in Biloxi. He was worried that he was going to get in a lot of trouble, and then there's this business of going to the bus station, being out in the rain. The next chapter, Rainy Night Blessings. Okay, let's take an intermission right here. The title for Rainy Night Blessings is stuck between pages that are titled at the top as Rainy Day Blessings, both before and after. And what I just mentioned about him being in the rain and having to get back to Biloxi, this story is set at night. So is the title page after the story? Something about that seems askew. But the heading at the top of each page is Rainy Day Blessings. During this rainy night story, Forrest went into the church bingo. He invested his 25 cents and ended up winning. He was one of the winners in the bingo game. Now he had $3.75, and he was worried about how he was going to pay for the bus fare to Biloxi. He got to the bus depot and found out he was 20 cents short, and the guy at the counter gave him the 20 cents. And it appears that this is where Forrest learned a little lesson about giving back to other people. Forrest laments at the end of this chapter that during wartime in Korea, that it was common for soldiers to be hitchhiking on the side of the road, and a soldier in uniform could easily get a ride wherever he needed to go. And Forrest says that would never happen today because public attitudes towards soldiers has worsened. Well, I think he's wrong on that. Soldiers are making a lot better money than they were at the time of the Korean War. And you compare Forrest, I think he was getting $95 a month. He couldn't afford bus fare. I mean, that has changed. Most soldiers are not so poor that they couldn't get to and from where they need to go. Next chapter, the Quahada Chief on a Black Pony. Here, Forrest talks about the history of the Comanche in central Texas, and they were up to northwest Texas, where that was their range, and where they frequently plundered and fought. And I like here, Forrest says that his imagination long ago fell prey to their way of life. This is the man who talks about how important imagination is, but he yields his imagination to the Comanche's way of life. He had a particular interest in Quanah Parker, and then, his mother was Cynthia Parker. Now, Cynthia was a white woman who was captured by the Comanches, lived with them for 24 years, had 3 children, and when Sewell Ross finally brought her back from captivity, she couldn't speak the English language anymore. She stopped eating and she died. A few years later, Quanah Parker, at a different battle, rode up to a U.S. cavalry trooper and shot him dead. 95 years later, Forrest and a friend, while they were in Lubbock, went out north of there to look for the burial site. He says they never found it, but they found other artifacts from that battle. Here, Forrest starts to wander off the reservation on pages 84 and 85. He would like to have found the grave site, to imagine being there at the time, listening to or watching the Indians. And here he says he would like to have thrown a rock at Quanah Parker, but then he says, I would have hoped to have missed. This reminds me of Forrest saying he would have liked to have been with the Indians at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. He says he would like to have known Mr. Carter. This was somebody who observed the battle where the U.S. cavalry trooper was killed. Forrest collected documents on Mr. Carter. He talks about at Quanah Parker how General McKenzie had routed the Comanches, including Quanah, through the Paladura Canyon. That's just south of Amarillo. Forrest says he's been up to Fort Sill outside of Lawton, Oklahoma, where he visited Quanah's gravesite, and he says it was a spiritual experience for him. I seem to recall elsewhere where we've talked about, Forrest and his spiritual or religious experiences. Forrest goes on about Quanah, saying he went from a ferocious warrior to a statesman and a leader of the peyote religion. And then he says the white man goes to church and talks about Jesus when the native Indian goes to his teepee and talks to Jesus. Next chapter, Prince of the Comanches. Here Forrest goes on more talking about Quanah and the Comanches. He mentions the town of Plainview. Now this is up on the Caprock, or the high plains of the Texas Panhandle. And Forrest says you can figure out the name. It's a Plainview because it's a flat, barren, and treeless terrain. But it was Indian country, and Quanah and company were plundering as they saw fit. And eventually President Grant got fed up and gave the order to control the Indians by whatever means necessary. In 1874, General Mackenzie went looking for Quanah and his band, but they couldn't find him. So they tied Jose Tafoya to a wagon wheel and tortured him until he revealed that Quanah was holed up in Paladura Canyon. When Quanah found out about this, he said, if I ever catch Tafoya, I'll boil him in oil. He felt that he had been betrayed by a friend, never mind the fact that he was being tortured. One thing here that I want to point out on this page, 88 I guess it is, Forrest has misspelled cavalry. It's written as calvary. Isn't that funny? He was just making fun of Christians. Anyway, I'm sure that's a simple error and nothing more, because I've been making that mistake as I've been going through this video. When Forrest was doing his bronze sculpting at his foundry in Lubbock, he proceeded to make a statue of Jose Tafoya, and he said he wasn't happy with the shirt, so he used a potato sack to create that textured look on the bronze statue, just like a shirt. Forrest and the other artist, Bill McClure, sold the bronze statue for a little bit of money, which he desperately needed, and then years later Forrest said he bought it back. Next chapter, Montana Golden. Finally, we've left history and gotten to the modern life of Forrest Fenn. This is about Forrest's trip up above the Madison River, going up Beaver Creek and then west on West Fork Beaver Creek to Avalanche Lake. This is a steep trail even today. I haven't been up there yet, but I believe that trail kind of peters out a ways up there, and the only people who go up there are usually on a horseback team. But like Forrest says, there's parts of that trail where you're kind of on a steep hill. If you lose your hat or lose your footing, down you go. Here, Forrest says he would take a fish with him, so if he met one of the grizzly bears up there, he would throw the fish and hope that the bear would stop for the fish, and that Forrest would have the greater motivation to run. Forrest says he hid his can of Dr. Pepper under a rock at Earthquake Lake. Now, in 1942, by the way, that would be a tin can, not aluminum. I asked Forrest in one email if he'd tell me exactly where that can was hidden precisely. I'd go back out there and get it. Of course, I'm sure after 70 years, tin would probably be rusted into oblivion. Forrest says he couldn't figure out why the fish wouldn't bite. I'd be amazed that there's actually fish way up in there. This is thousands of feet up, but he says he found the freshwater shrimp along the shore of that lake, and that's what the fish were feeding on. But he went back weeks later with his friend Donnie Heath, and he was going to teach the fish a thing or two. Forrest says that he took Peggy up there at some later time. Now, I never thought of Peggy as being the avid outdoorsman. You have to have a little bit of stamina to go up that hike. Even today, if you're going from the Forest Service Road, it's 5 miles, it's steep. It's not an easy trip, but according to Forrest here, the sleeping bag didn't keep her warm. The mosquitoes, if you kill one, a dozen show up to the funeral. And he says there wasn't a third night. They left. Remnants of the past. Here's where Forrest talks about at a ranch in northeastern New Mexico, digging up what was believed to be a woolly mammoth tusk. And during this excavation work, they found an ancient knife. And he said he believed it was a very old tusk because there wasn't enough collagen left in it to do carbon-14 dating, so he was estimating it to be 50,000 years old. He said it was about 70 pounds once he got the thing back to his house, the tusk, but that it eventually dried and crumbled. He says he would like to go back and dig up the other tusk, but he knows he's too old. And then he asked the question of what that stream will be like when his bones are old enough not to have any collagen in them. So there's a stream involved. Now that could be interesting because we're looking for streams. Now I know if he's talking about northeastern New Mexico, that's out past the mountains and in the desert. Forrest speaks of the reverence of finding paleo projectiles, and he mentions a chert rock point that he picked up in Schertz, Texas. Now that's a town that's since been gobbled up by urban sprawl out of San Antonio. There's no empty spot of land now. You could dig anything there. Things I covet. In this chapter, Forrest Fenn talks about once collecting paint palettes. You know, the thing that a painter dabbles his paintbrush in. And he eventually got rid of most of those, but he talks about them being $6,500. The things people collect, I would have never thought of it. Forrest mentions Ben Stahl as another friend who, I think, painted one of these scenes of how the West was won, and he painted a lot of popular saloon scenes. He talks about how he illustrated parts of, Gone with the Wind. They said over 700 of his paintings had appeared in the Saturday Evening Post. The Saturday Evening Post is where Norman Rockwell had most of his paintings displayed. Next chapter. Well, here's Moses. Forrest starts off with this statement saying he wonders why more people today are not named Moses. Well, Forrest, there are. I read Israeli news sites every week, and I can tell you if you're a Jew in Israel, there's plenty of people named Moshe, which is Hebrew for Moses. In this story, Forrest has Leo Salazar carving, a statue of Moses out of a piece of wood. But Forrest thought that Moses looked too new and too white, so he sat him out on the porch for 3 years and let the sun and the rain weather him more. And then, after the 3 years, the wind toppled Moses and broke his hand. And Forrest glues him back together, sticks him in the house, and says that Moses is watching over him as he's writing this very chapter. Next chapter, Salute to a Warrior. Here Forrest tells the story of Renelle Jacobson. She came to visit Forrest. She found out about the treasure hunt from that United Airlines Hemispheres magazine. And she would subsequently go hunting for that treasure, I think, 4 more times. She says she felt like a kid, being silly but acting childish for the excitement of hunting for a treasure chest. Well, aren't we all? Renelle had a bone disease and had a leg amputated, so hunting for a treasure in the traditional sense is a little bit more complicated than for most of us. But somehow she managed to get access to a helicopter and go searching the wilds of Yellowstone. I wonder how that was accomplished, to get permission to fly a helicopter. But she talked about finding top secret waterfalls, and there are some out there that are 15 miles away from the nearest parking spot, and there are some I know of that have never had published photographs. Forrest says that he can't even imagine her spirit. She talks about trying to solve the Fenn puzzle, and she feels that she is accomplishing something by working on it. Forrest adds the postscript that Renelle subsequently succumbed to her disease, and she had shortly before then communicated to Forrest about her concern about her horse. Why is it we've had several references to horses in these stories? Forrest said that when Renelle died, that the angels cried, and he lowered his heart to half-mast. Certainly someone worth admiring for her courage. For those who don't know already, my father is an amputee, stepped on a landmine in Vietnam. So I know a little bit about what she dealt with and the things she couldn't do. The Iron Rooster of Santa Fe County. Here Forrest talks about buying 2 bronze chickens. And his wife wants to check his temperature. Like, why would you buy this? So then he started suffering from buyer's remorse. But Forrest had the chickens painted, and I noticed that they were 70 pounds. Now, didn't we just hear that those woolly mammoth tusks were 70 pounds? Of course, they had to learn how to paint this bronze chicken. It's like trying to paint a car engine. You have to have special paint, or I think they said they heated up the chicken. You have to work with something hot. But Forrest has high hopes for Joanna's paintings. Next chapter, Lessons from Forrest. This is about Forrest Gist, or Forrest Gist. And I noticed that Forrest cannot make up his mind whether this Forrest is spelled with 1 R or 2. Kind of like the issue with Forrest Fenn and his birth certificate. But this person was a potter, a pot maker back in Lubbock. Now this is the second person in this book that made pots. The other was that woman with the divorce who made a pot to resemble her divorce. Forrest Fenn went to see Forrest Gist, and he was smashing his pottery in the floor. Forrest said he didn't approve of the guy's quality control methods, but Mr. Gist didn't want any pottery going out the door with his name on it if it wasn't perfect. Forrest thought they looked pretty good. Forrest acknowledged his own quality control methods. If he couldn't get the hooves on a buffalo just right, then he would design the buffalo standing in the mud where he couldn't see his feet. Forrest says that maybe his skill will improve over time, a long time. He says he still keeps a couple of these bronze sculptures to remind him of what not to ever try again. Forrest decided to do art gallery work instead. And he didn't like the painting of the Scream until he saw a copy of it that sold for $119 million. Then he acknowledged that he didn't have very good taste in art. So he made millions of dollars selling art. Memories that never die. Well, we know that Forrest Fenn survived being shot down twice. But this chapter is about George Dabich, who survived 2 naval attacks in 24 hours. I think Forrest may have had an affinity for this guy for several reasons. One was his ability to survive in battle. The other was because he was an outdoorsman and a painter. And he lived outside of Cody, another place we know Forrest is fond of. They decided that after their military days they would meet up in Cody, and Dabich would help Forrest find some buffalo skulls and buffalo caps, and they eventually did. And Forrest has one of them in the picture here. He said this one young skull was his best, and there's a basalt arrowhead stuck in it. And here again, Forrest says, I wish that I had been with the Indian who released that arrow to fly its last mission. What is this, the 3rd time he wished he was with the Indians? Dabich gave this hat to Forrest Fenn that he liked so much. He says his hunters, or he wore it while his hunters killed 28 grizzlies east of Yellowstone. That must have been a different time. Forrest says that when Dabich died at age 91, his death went unnoticed except for a scant few people like Forrest. So here we have that word scant from the poem that's used to mean few. Forrest says that the coyotes, the pine trees, and the sagebrush will know that he's gone. Pine trees and sagebrush are part of the clues we've been given. And I noticed that here on this page where that is written, was it page 123, is a map of the east side of Yellowstone, including the highway going out from the east side of Yellowstone just before it gets to the Buffalo Bill Cody Reservoir in the city of Cody. Interesting. That's where the grizzlies were that the guy had killed. Me and Mummy Joe. Forrest says that if you're headed out the east entrance of Yellowstone, headed east towards Cody, you'll come up on this cave off to the left where he used to sit and drink his Dr. Pepper. And 25 years later, he would meet the men who excavated that cave. One is Bob Edgar, and the other is the George Dabich, who we read about in the previous chapter. Forrest says that on one occasion, he and Dabich were having dinner at the Irma Cafe. Now, in my version of this book, he's got Irma misspelled. Irma is with an I, and it's spelled here with an E. But he talks about the point that was discovered, that the weapon was designed to kill ancient bison. There were other knives and tools and projectiles that had been discovered in this cave. This little cave that Mummy Joe was found in, Forrest says that he and his family would stop there and, take the shade for lunch as they were on their way back to Texas. Could this have been one of those important spots to Forrest Fenn? Forrest is always hearkening back to ancient peoples and ancient wars and ancient cultures, and here he's revering this cave and wondering if he's sitting his butt on the very rock where people thousands of years ago were sitting. Forrest says he visited this cave once in the middle of the night to experience this pitch black of darkness. Is this along the same lines of thinking in the cemetery and temple? Next chapter, Algernon's relative. Forrest describes this drunk guy who is a descendant of Lieutenant Algernon Smith from the Civil War. This drunk guy comes into Forrest's office offering to sell him 3 books that were 3 times the price they were worth, but Forrest hurriedly paid the man anyway because he said when that guy finishes spending his money on liquor, he'll have nothing left to show for it, but I'll have these 3 books that'll last forever. Didn't Forrest say something like that before about a sandwich? The sandwich will be gone in a few minutes, but something else you could buy would endure forever, and those are the things that Forrest treasures. Forrest Fenn has several reasons to have an affinity for this Lieutenant Algernon Smith, because both of them had been a lieutenant and, in that capacity, an aide-de-camp to a major general. Another thing is this Algernon fella had several survival stories in the military. He survived the Civil War, had multiple horses shot out from under him. He survived a fierce battle at Cold Harbor and at Drury's Farm, and he survived being shot near the Cape Fear River. Then Algernon finds himself being assigned to Mr. Custer, the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Algernon initially survived multiple campaigns during these Indian wars, the Battle of the Washita, the Yellowstone campaign, and finally he met his fate up at the Bighorn battlefield. I think it was the second effort where he died was at Last Stand Hill. Forrest gets poetic about this story. He says one thing is, fickle is the finger that points at success. And he points out that Algernon, in many cases, his survival depended upon the accuracy of someone else's rifle. In other words, other people saved his life in many of those previous battles. Next chapter, Cultures on Top of Cultures. Here on the very first line, Forrest starts out with a poetic excerpt. When war is rife and dangers nigh. Well, there's that word nigh that's in our poem, and here it means near. Forrest is in Arizona meeting with another soldier, this one from World War II, and they're out together. They find a cave-like dwelling in a tight canyon hidden behind cottonwood trees, and as always, Forrest wonders if Paleo Man 10,000 years ago had also taken refuge in that tight space. He found a chert knife that was wrapped with a stretch of sinew. It looks like a prehistoric rope. Forrest wonders if 100 years from now we're going to be in prehistoric times again and we'll have to make weapons that way. Tucker, the guy who owned this ranch, liked being alone, apparently. Only his dog and horse for company. There's another horse. Next chapter, the evolution of my art opinion. Forrest talks about how he began his art gallery business knowing nothing about art. He was in the right place at the right time with the right product. He compared artists with General Motors making cars. And just as the car is the product, he considered the painting to be a product. In 1975, he said, we acquired a painting from Nikolai Fetchin for $7,500, sold it 2 weeks later at 100% profit. So he knew how he was going to make money. He started by borrowing a few pieces of artwork and putting them on display, and somehow hoping that people would think he was an expert at art. Forrest bemoans these distinctions about traditional and abstract art. He says that the definition of abstract art finds no home in his affections. That there's another one that says that traditions are thrown aside and that abstract art is based on experimentation. Forrest says that's a little bit better. Someone tried to sell Forrest an Andy Warhol painting of a tin can. Doesn't that sound like modern art rubbish? Who would want it? The finger painting that I did in kindergarten looks better than this stuff. It was in 1988 that he sold his art business and signed a no-compete agreement with the new owner. 88, of course, is the interesting year. That's when he had cancer. And that Nikolai Fetchin art that started out as $7,500, a few years later it was selling again for $850,000. Doug Hyde in stone. Apparently, Doug Hyde came upon the art scene about the same time as Forrest Fenn. But Mr. Hyde designed sculptures, and apparently a lot of those were being sold to the city of Scottsdale, Arizona. Forrest says that's where a lot of the money was coming from, and Forrest helped him do the selling and marketing. Now, Forrest says that Doug Hyde is mostly Nez Perce. That was the Indians that there's numerous things named after them, from along the Chief Joseph Highway northwest of Cody all the way over to the Big Hole National Battlefield in southwestern Montana. I think at one point they went through the area by Madison Junction and Ojo Caliente, which Forrest Fenn has referred to. I've been a little bit curious about Forrest's love for the Indians, and where all Nez Perce has, where his band of Indians went, that are also places that Forrest has been. Forrest says he has one of Doug Hyde's sculptures of a Nez Perce chief that is 27 inches high. On page 147, Forrest says that these sculptures are a threshold moment for him, reminding him of the change that is resonating across silent mountains. Now, that threshold moment thing we read of in The Thrill of the Chase, when he was left standing on the side of the road as he was fleeing from A&M. What is it about this sculpture that's a threshold moment in his life? I mean, this is when Forrest is up in years. He then talks about it as though it's not in his life, but a reference to how galloping horses would be replaced by locomotives. So maybe he's referring to that as a historical context in the change for the western states. This chapter starts to wander around. Forrest then talks about Joe Crow, who was the last of the war chiefs of the Crow tribe. That's up at the Bighorn battlefield area. And Joe would tell Forrest Fenn stories of his great uncle, who was a scout for General Custer. Isn't that kind of like being a traitor, working for the wrong side? It sounds like the same story we were listening to earlier out of the Paladura Canyon, where Quanah Parker was betrayed by one of his own who was being tortured. Forrest begins to wax sentimental. looking at sculptures where he describes seeing tears in the sculptures of these Indians. And he talks about what that sentiment means to him. And when Joe is talking about how when he was a kid and is asking his tribal elders if the government would ever give their future back to them, and it's Forrest who answers by saying, "I hope so, Joe." Now, Doug Hyde has a son named Buffalo Hyde. This is Hyde. Buffalo Hyde. We just read a few pages back about that, was it the hat that may have been made out of buffalo hide? Well, this Buffalo Hyde person is a painter, so no wonder Forrest likes him. And he's a painter who only has one arm, but Forrest talks about how acclaimed his work is. Next chapter, Apaches in the Garage. This lady, Josette, calls Forrest Fenn from San Antonio, virtually demanding that he come to San Antonio from Santa Fe to come to her garage sale. And Forrest told her to wake up. She was having a nightmare. You want me to fly hundreds of miles to come to a garage sale? But the garage sale turned out to be an auction for the General Bullis collection. Now, General Bullis is the namesake for Camp Bullis down in San Antonio. I spent a week down at that establishment nearly 20 years ago. But Forrest said that Josette had integrity and she wasn't willing to sell anything until 7 a.m. the next morning when the auction started. And at 7 a.m. Forrest bought the whole lot because he had an opportunity to look at it. It was like an Apache collection of many artifacts that Forrest wanted. There were robes, pottery, beads. Forrest paid the lady, and she even agreed to package everything up and ship it by U-Haul. Forrest points out that General Bullis was an accomplished Civil War soldier who retired as a brigadier general and then a few years later dropped dead of a stroke at age 70. General Bullis at one point was in a mission to capture Geronimo. So there's this other connection to Indians. Next chapter, Me and Michael Douglas. In this chapter, Forrest is talking about how Michael Douglas came into his gallery in Santa Fe. And I think Forrest sold him 5 of these African sculptures that he had previously acquired from Sosoko. And he was worried that they were too fragile to ship, so Forrest flew them to California. He delivered them personally. And he spent some more time with Michael Douglas at his house and admiring his opulence. And while Michael Douglas went in the house to get more wine, a man came up, sat beside him for a couple of minutes, mumbled some things, and got up and left. And supposedly that was Elton John. And Forrest's family gave him grief because he didn't notice who it was. He said, you know, I'm born 100 years too late. If that had been Billy the Kid sat down beside me, I would have recognized him. The next chapter, Is It My Candy Ann? Forrest says that a person provided him with these sculpture-looking things. They appear to be naturally weathered objects that might remind you of other images of a person or some other statue. But then Forrest spends 2 pages going poetic about the Candy Ann, which was the helicopter that rescued him on one of his shot-down experiences in Vietnam. Next chapter, the Gracie Ella experience. Here, Pony, a person in Santa Fe, came to Forrest Fenn looking for an expensive piece of artwork by Robert Henry. Now, Forrest apparently knew enough about that artist to know that the paintings were valuable when they could be found. Now, Forrest says he's not an expert at art. I wouldn't know anything about these people. Pony was a conversationalist, so Forrest said he tended to show up at her dinners, parties, and art exhibitions. But after a few weeks, Forrest was able to find a Henry painting. It was named Gracie Ella. Forrest bought it. Forrest didn't like this painting, and he shows a picture of it. It looks like something you wouldn't want on your wall either. But he called Pony to let her know that he had found a painting by this artist, and she said she would be coming over and bringing Cary Grant. Well, Forrest was ecstatic that Cary Grant was going to be in his gallery because he liked Cary Grant's movie, To Catch a Thief. But when Pony got there, she stared at the painting, and she didn't look to be too impressed herself. And she eventually strode right back out the door with Cary Grant in tow. Apparently neither Pony nor Cary Grant even bothered to say goodbye, and he didn't hear from her for a few days after that. Forrest said he had to go to the refrigerator and get a bottle of Worcestershire sauce to clear his head. Pony would come back and apparently again would say nothing, looking at that morbid painting. But eventually Pony called Forrest on the phone, insisting that she had to have it. Forrest initially told her that, you haven't expressed interest in that painting, and I've grown to like it, and I wanted to keep it here. And then Pony screams in his ear, and Forrest was worried that she was about to have a physical issue, so he relented. And then for some reason later he felt the need to read his Bible. Was he feeling guilty for letting her have this awful painting, or for trying to withhold it from her? As a side note, Forrest talks about Pony keeping conversations going at her social events by lighting candles as she was walking around the room, as if that somehow facilitates conversation. I don't know if this means anything, but this background text on page 161 is from the Gospel according to Matthew. Part of it starts in chapter 2 and goes through part of chapter 4. Partying with Suzanne Summers. Here, Forrest Fenn talks about riding in the airplane with Shiloh piloting the plane on their way to Palm Springs to meet with Suzanne Summers. Now, first of all, I don't know how a fighter pilot ever gets to the point where he trusts someone else flying. And apparently he didn't. He blames the weather. He says, how do you fly VFR under clouds that are kissing the ground? He kept his eyes closed for the first 100 miles. When they got to California and they got to Suzanne Summers' property, they had to follow directions because there is no address. And when they went up to a gate and called to be given access, it took them a while to convince whoever was in charge of security that they were not really terrorists and were then allowed in. But there were no roads going up to the house. When the house was built, they used burros to carry the supplies up the side of this hill, and they ended up going in an open-air tram up the hillside over a field of rattlesnakes. They were greeted at the top by George Hamilton, who had made 57 movies, and then there was a lady with an unforgettable face who had lived with Elvis Presley for 7 years, and then he says, but I couldn't remember her name. I'm assuming he's referring to Priscilla because they dated for 7 years before they got married. Forrest says that Shiloh was impressed with all of these accolades of the people in front of him, but Forrest tried to appear indifferent. Another person they met was a shipping magnate who had just stepped down from running an oil company where he was making a meager $100 million per year. How do you begin to socialize with people that make $100 million per year? I wouldn't know how to act. So Shiloh is flirting with Suzanne's daughter and some other billionaire widow that was at this gathering. There was an orchestra present. This lady's body that shook with the music. Forrest said, I didn't know there were that many parts that could move. She had to take breaks because she was exhausted from her gyrations. At dinner, Forrest said that he sat next to Suzanne, who had to introduce him to 100 people. I can't help but wonder why all these rich billionaire types would even care about who Forrest Fenn is. But Forrest says that as the candles were dimming low, that they went back to their motel, and then Shiloh decided to go back to this party until the candles died of old age. They went back the next morning for breakfast, and then drank some fruity mixed concoction that apparently Suzanne liked because she was a health nut. They met more famous people, got back on their airplane, flew back to Santa Fe, and Forrest says that Shiloh couldn't see the instruments, but he eventually found the lights so they could land. Forrest said his visit to Palm Spring was ego-shrinking and mind-expanding. He had also said that he felt something like a dime at a dollar bill convention. Next chapter, The Bullet Comes Home. This is the story about his 1935 Plymouth Tudor. He supposedly bought that in Atlanta after he made that solo trip from West Yellowstone to Georgia on a train that he was mostly standing up in. Anyway, he bought the car, drove it back to Temple, Texas. Peggy, in their high school days, Peggy said the car, she called it the Bullet because it was shot. He tells this mysterious story when he went back to West Yellowstone in the summer of 1950 with his family. It was one of these seminal years for him. 3 months while he was away, he missed Peggy and he missed his car. But that fall, 3 things happened. Peggy started school at the University of Houston, Forrest joined the Air Force, and something mysterious happened to the Bullet. No one in town was willing to tell him what happened to his car while he was gone. So 63 years later, Forrest finds somebody to get a twin of the Bullet. He paid to have this car shipped in from Maryland. He drove it around town for a couple of months, but he said it just wasn't the same. His arms were weary of trying to steer without power steering. He got flooded sticking his hand out the window to indicate a turn, and the window wiper stopped in the middle of the thunderstorm. And Peggy was no longer in the mood to ride in a 65-year-old car. The moment had passed. He said when he sold the car, he lost $4,000 on it. But he says, referring to the car, they don't make romance like they used to. No, they have power steering and air conditioning. Forrest used this reference that says once you leave home, you can never come back, and he applied that to the Bullet. He said it was important to him at a time when he was developing meaning in his life, but after that moment passed, it was no longer useful to him. It no longer gave him meaning. The next chapter, The Price of Freedom. Forrest talks about being at an art show in Great Falls, Montana. And one thing that I noticed here is he's referring to his garage back in Lubbock. This is 1967. And he says that he's just learning this practice of, or the lost practice of wax casting. Now that came up here recently in the discussion about could there have been like a wax casting mold of the treasure chest and why there could be multiple replicas of it. At this art show, Alex pulled out a wax model of a wolf that was chewing its own leg off because it had been caught in a trap. And it was something that gave Forrest pause. He purchased this wax model from Alex with the agreement that he would only make 30 copies in bronze. Forrest named this bronze statue The Price of Freedom, talking about an animal that has to chew its leg off from something like a bear trap. A few years later, Alex and his wife were floating down the Missouri River near Great Falls in Montana when they saw a friend drowning in the water. Alex dove in the water, was able to save his friend, but himself, he drowned. And Forrest says he thinks of that every time he looks at this bronze statue of the price of freedom. Forrest has spoken before about how bronze casting is dangerous. And when he tried doing that in Santa Fe, I think the fire department showed up. Here he mentions on page 174 that when he dropped some of this molten bronze on the driveway, the concrete exploded. So there he learned to do it over a sandbox. On the back cover, inside the back cover of this book, I noticed that Forrest thanks Jessica Jenkins, who fought heavily with Forrest Fenn as to where the commas were supposed to go. Now this is Forrest Fenn, who despises the proper rules of grammar and sentence structure. Could it be that by the time Forrest was writing Once Upon a While, he was somehow being compelled to obey the rules of the English language? Well, that's about it for this summary and commentary on the book Once Upon a While. remember to click like, share, subscribe, comment, and donate.